Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last but certainly not least, all of you with confirmation bias. You will find what you're looking for. You're listening to Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix, a family-friendly podcast where we logically speculate on life. Trigger warning for this episode is we're going to have a logical conversation. We're definitely going to play into the Socratic method a bit. It could get a little theological. We're going to keep gears shifted as best we can to more the philosophical and the logical, but we are discussing the validity or the lack thereof of Scripture on this podcast. We have a guest with us for this episode, and he's going to lay out the facts. And I'm going to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit here and take the other side, even though, as our listeners do know, I am Christian. That's where I'm coming from. But I'm going to kind of argue the other side on this podcast a little bit more just for that Socratic method purpose here, so you can hear both sides of the argument laid out in a fair and civilized manner. Beyond that, if you're listening on Spotify or any other podcast streaming platform, please give us a rating there. If you're listening on YouTube, please give us a like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, as it definitely helps us gain traction for these future episodes that we're doing. Trace, if you wouldn't mind giving us a fish fact.
All right, so the male anglerfish sticks to and morphs into the female anglerfish. So the males are actually a lot smaller and they look very different from what you might think of when you think of an anglerfish. So that's the female. So the male will like bite. I think they bite onto the female and then they kind of fuse into it, and then they become like one entity.
That's definitely interesting there. What exactly is the anglerfish for our listeners? Because I know I can't visualize that off the top of my head.
So, my best reference is in Finding Nemo, that fish with the light bulb on a stick.
Oh, right. Okay, yep, that makes sense. I got you. Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so the light bulb fish, got it. I'm not the fish nerd, as you can tell, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers and musers. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest here. So our guest for this episode is Harrison Smith. He is an ordained minister by First Baptist Church of Birmingham of the Southern Baptist Convention. So we can refer to him as Father or Reverend here. No, I'm kidding. He's got a Bachelor's of Science in Organizational Leadership. He's currently working on a Master's of Christian Counseling and of Divinity as well from Seminary of Southern Baptist Convention. And also, ladies and gentlemen, he is a martial arts expert. This is the guest I referenced a few weeks back that gave me the black eye. So now you all get to hear what all he has to say. And basically, if I disagree with him by the end of this podcast, I'm going to probably get beat up or something. I don't know. So with that being said, I'll kick it over to you, Harrison, to introduce yourself and to start us in this logical discourse.
Well, hello there. Please do not call me Father. That is not who I am. As he said, I am a Reverend in the Southern Baptist Convention. I've been ordained for just over a year now. I've been licensed to preach for the past 4 or 5 years, and I've been a devout studier of just kind of everything in the Bible, why it happened, how it came to be. So it's not just coming in and just trying to assume. We actually put some tests into where we come and get all the words of the Bible from. So it's not just some silly thing that came together by chance over 1,500 years. We were going to talk about kind of the logical side of things first. They invited me to come in and talked for 3 episodes, so I guess that's their mistake, not mine. But we're going to put out 3 different episodes here. This first episode today, we're going to be talking about just the logical arguments behind the Bible and its divine origins. So we're going to take time to kind of explore just, how we can reason about whether or not the Bible is actually divine in its origin, or whether or not it's just happen chance writings. Then When I come back the next time, we're going to talk about the actual historical evidence behind the Bible. How was it written? How was it transcribed and translated and so forth? And then when I come back the third time, we're going to go into what we call an apologetical defense of the Bible, which is going to get into all those fun arguments about fairies and dragons and all that sort of fun stuff.
Apologetics. I'm sorry, what was that?
Apologetics. Apologetics is just a fancy way of saying I'm going to argue in defense of my faith. Not to sound any fancy or use words that we're not familiar with. It's just the professional academic term for this discipline, as they call it.
So basically what I'm hearing is that you're going to apologize for, the 3 episodes and say that you're wrong.
I'm not going to sit here and apologize for 3 episodes. Though I think you will be apologizing for how many times you're going to have to say the same thing.
Yeah, fair enough, I suppose. Well, I guess, all that being said, why don't you kick us off on your first logical argument here?
All right. So we're going to start here. You have to have some sort of presupposition, right? Because we are talking about a divine origin of the Bible. So we are going to have to suppose the existence of a God. But don't worry, you fact seekers. I am going to actually present an argument for God, and let that be our first logical argument here, right? So I am going to suppose God's existence, specifically the Christian God, because, that's what I believe. We're not taking this without the foregoing of logic, right? And it's not hard to see with most cultures and societies around the world that they believe in some sort of supernatural being or beings to exist. But I will make a brief explanation of what's called the teleological argument, or the argument from the end state, as I believe it's the most relevant for the logical arguments that we're going to be making following on the Bible's origins. So the teleological argument, or the famous watchmaker argument, is an argument from the end state. So end in Greek is teleo, and so we get that sort of end in logical argument, right? So the first premise is that when we create something as a human, right, we can see that there is a design in it. So I go out and I make this watch. It has to be made specifically, otherwise it's not going to work. The cogs have to match together, right? There's intentional design and deliberation that gets put into this. It doesn't just come and spring into existence, right? So that's the first premise. Secondly, the universe and everything in it is very carefully balanced. You can see thought in it, right? The way that the sun sits has the exact distance away from the earth so that we can have life on earth. The tilt of the axis of the earth, how our magnetic poles sit around, and how that affects those tides with the way that the moon is set out from the earth, right? We can see that there is design in the life around us. It doesn't just happen, right? It is evidence of an intelligent design. Moving into there, from there we can see that our universe is complex. It's vast, right, in comparison to our human creations. So we must be able to reason that something is far more intelligent than a human, and thus this being must also be more powerful than a human. So I'm going to kind of pause there and let you react and give me your initial thoughts on that.
You're not going to get a disagreement from me here. I'm trying to argue the other side, but I've talked about this on the show before. I don't think that there's much room to say that there isn't a God or some kind of divine being. Now, how you might want to define that being, there may be a little bit of room for debate and discussion, but I don't think in terms of just looking at the complexity of the universe, I don't think it's an irrational or illogical conclusion in any way, shape, or form to come to the conclusion that, hey, there likely is a God. You have anything you want to add in on that, Trace?
Yeah, I think with every culture, like you said, having some sort of higher power, there has to be something out there. Now, whether it be the Christian God or a pantheon of gods, or you could even make an argument of aliens or something. There's always something that someone we'll say to attribute to, oh, there's a higher power somewhere.
Yeah, you see this common in myth. It's a relatively new thing for humanity as a whole to believe the idea that there actually is no God at all. That's definitely a recent addition within the last thousands of years of documented history. Yeah. Any other final interjections you have, Trace? I think we're due for a short ad break right about now.
Yeah, no, I think those are all pretty good points for the first argument here.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. We will be back after this brief word from our sponsor. All right, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, we're back. We're here with Harrison Smith, and he's laying out a logical argument for God for us here. So back over to you, sir.
Yeah, and I just lost my mouse. Sorry, that was a bit distracting. Okay, so y'all seemed a little stumped there trying to talk about an argument against this whole teleological argument. So I just wanted to kind of be fair and play devil's advocate to my own argument here, which is unnatural for me, but hey. So the other end, the typical atheistic point of view when confronted with this will typically refer to your evolutionary theory and your ideas that you could have an existence that is perchance, like literally by chance. And so you have to start looking at the odds of things happening the way they happened. And so to say, as they often do, that there was the Big Bang and that everything came from nothing starts to come against, I think it's like 1 in a trillion odds. I can't remember the number off the top of my head for that one. To just suddenly burst out into all the universe. And then furthermore, you start looking at the odds for individual events, such as a single-cell organism to, by chance, become a multi-cell organism, which is another about 1 in a trillion chance. So you have 2 1 in a trillion chances just to get the evolutionary chain started. And so just from those two, it would seem almost literally impossible for such miraculous odds to happen at the same time. So that's kind of the basis. I'm not the great advocate for them, but it's obviously not my argument.
Yeah, and then I think you run into some other problems with this as well. And this is admittedly getting a little bit ahead here. We do have a couple episodes queued up where I'm going to talk about holes in the standard model that's taught in school. Not to necessarily absolutely disprove it, but just to point out that, hey, there's a lot of things that tend to get missed when the argument's presented in school. My biggest issue with the whole idea of single-celled organisms and everything is you still have DNA, and it's still incredibly complex, even at the single-cell simple organism side. And so you have to bear in mind that DNA is a language, and the language comes from an intelligence. And so, I mean, if you want to believe that's from chance, that's 100% your prerogative. We're not going to force any belief down anyone's throat. But I would say of the two, to me, it sounds more logical that there is some kind of instigator or creator to create the language system of DNA. So, I mean, I hear the other side of the argument. I can respect the other side of the argument, but I guess my point of contention is I see a lot of times where like people believe, in any kind of theistic religion, whether it's Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, take your pick, in Norse mythology, whatever you want to believe in. These people often get called unscientific and illogical, and I feel like nothing could be further from the truth, because we're here as three Christians from 3 different backgrounds sitting down having a logical discussion and a logical discourse on these topics. And yeah, I don't feel like looking at the universe, it's an illogical conclusion to say that there could be a creator and that there likely is a creator by any means. You have anything to add on that, Trace?
No, I think you hit all the right points there.
All right. Well, so I will provide my own counterpoint to my counterpoint, just because I like playing and having actual exercises here. Just, hey, it's the point of why we're here to talk, right? So the biggest thing that I have against evolution is that you would have to eventually be able to connect back to all species back to one single species, right? But then let's take a woodpecker, right? Just a woodpecker. You'd have to see evidence of a woodpecker with shorter and shorter beaks and shorter tongues, right? But there really is no evidence that we can see or that we've seen in the fossil records of a woodpecker with a skull that doesn't have the slot for its tongue to roll all the way back into its head. You would have to see something where that bird came from another type of bird, or that it came from dinosaurs, which is another very common explanation of that. As they say, the Tyrannosaurus turned into a chicken, which I think that's a stretch, but that is their argument, and again, not the best to explain that. Or another fun one is the anteater. That the anteater not the anteater. I'm drawing a blank here.
You thinking maybe the platypus?
No. I'm gonna have to take a rain check on that one. That's more for my apologetical argument, anyways. Later, so
he apologizes for forgetting there.
I do apologize for forgetting.
Thus the apologetics.
I'm gonna add that to my notes for next time.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're not going to get any major disagreement from me there. There's a lot of, and again, this is getting ahead. We'll talk about this one in the holes in the standard model episode in next month or so here. But you have missing links. And they're called missing links for a reason, and they're missing, and we don't know where they are. Where if there was millions and millions and millions of years of evolution, even with the improbability of fossils being formed and the right conditions of fossils being formed, you would still see more of these things in the fossil record. And so evolution is missing a lot of its key points in these species and everything. Now, there are also counter arguments to that, but I don't want to get too far onto the tangent rabbit trail on this one, unless Trace is down for that. What are you thinking, Trace?
I was going to agree with you there, and I believe I've seen some things about like species that shouldn't be in this certain area, because you know how when we dig up fossils and stuff, the different layers are like different eras of time, and sometimes there'll be different species that shouldn't be in said era, but it is. I can't say of any exact cases right now, but I believe I've seen a few of those before, so that's another like big flaw there.
It's almost like those layers don't indicate time so much as they do just natural sorting from a certain process that would involve a lot of water. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself for the next couple episodes here.
I love it because that's where I'm going in 2 episodes.
Fantastic. I love it. Yeah, I mean, could you imagine though, like let's take a quick segue here for a second. Like, could you imagine being the Tyrannosaurus Rex and that you're the apex predator and somehow you evolve into the chicken? That just blows my mind to go from the apex predator to like the most docile, farmable like animal. Okay, maybe chickens aren't quite docile, but you get my idea here. That okay, maybe relatively harmless, except for maybe in this like you're an insect or something. But going from the apex predator to eating all of these things to evolving to a chicken, I don't know. I feel like that's not evolving up the tree. That's devolving. That's kind of going down the tree in a sense.
But I mean, they did evolve the ability to be more reproductive, if that is the case.
All right, resident dinosaur nerd, why don't you chip in here a little bit and give us some thoughts?
On what, the T-Rex evolving into a chicken?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Oh man, I don't even know if I have an argument for that, to be honest, because that's just kind of a common phrase there, but I don't know the actual data to back it up. Besides that, most dinosaurs have like bird bone structures, or just like bird-like traits, really. That's from what I can tell is the only link.
No, it's definitely a hard case to prove. Just the whole idea of macroevolution has been a very tough case, which is why you'll see that they insist that there must be millions upon millions of years, actually billions of years within this whole chain. And so my thing is, if that is the case, then they state that fossils take hundreds of millions of years to form. So why isn't there more evidence if the Earth has been around for that long? Certainly, these species that were once so vibrant and widespread, why don't we see more of this fossil evidence? And I understand we've had, things like floods and asteroids, but these fossils were remarkably well preserved. We find dozens of them, but there's nothing branching those chains.
Yeah, no, you're not going to get any disagreement from me there. There's definitely this is going to play into our future conversation for holes in the standard model. I'll definitely be referencing back to this whole discussion here. There's a lot of holes. There's a lot of missing links. There's a lot of questions even, because if fossils do take millions and billions of years, how come we have fossilized things like helmets lost in the 1940s and 50s? We have fossils from World War II. It's not necessarily about the time frame. It's more about the conditions that are present or the lack thereof for the forming of fossils. You have evidence of two fish being fossilized together where one fish is eating the other fish. And this plays into your fish nerd stuff, Trace. And it's like, okay, well, if this was laid down slowly over time, over millions and billions of years, how is there a fossil of a fish eating another fish? Because that would be pretty instantaneous. At the very least, one of the fish would get away or something. There'd be something that would play into that. You wouldn't want to sit in another fish's mouth being eaten for like, a couple thousand years or whatever, however long they're saying it takes for fossils to form. So I would definitely agree. There's definitely a lot of holes in it. And yeah. Well, unless you got anything else for us here, let's transition to your next thought and your next flow in the logical argument so we can get a little bit of the Socratic method going.
Alrighty.
Well, I do want to add in here that fossils is a very exact science into how they form, really. So you could argue that there are some of these holes here because whatever species or missing link may just not have formed, or maybe the bones have been misidentified, because that happens all the time. I mean, a lot of our new species of dinosaurs are just reconsiderations of old fossils, and it's like, oh, maybe that's a little different, and then they create a whole new species off of it. Like they just branched. There's a lot of debate over the Nanotyrannus and if it's an entirely new species or if it's just a juvenile T-Rex. There's just all kinds of stuff like that everywhere in the fossil record. So, it could just be that whatever species, it's not a guaranteed science of if it will form.
Yeah, I can give you that point for certain. I understand that we're still discovering new fossils, and we're still like trying to figure out how these skeletons put together. Because none of us have seen these creatures alive ourselves. So I could definitely see that and understand that. So my only kind of counterpoint to that would be to say we've discovered so many of them, but we still aren't seeing much in the actual branch chain to go from so drastic of these creatures to the modern day animals that we see now. So that's the only thing. Like we're still missing like that real link between these two styles of the dinosaurs that we see in their skeletons to our modern day animals.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you there. There is definitely some jumps in the evolution tree from what I've seen.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of them might be close enough that you could like kind of be like, okay, I can kind of see that. And I'm sure, maybe it has, because I do think there is some slight form of evolution, but maybe not as drastic as a T-Rex into a chicken.
Yeah, I would definitely agree that there is some form of evolution as a whole, because you see diversity in parent to offspring. But the biggest thing that's often missed is that when you have these changes, it's not a gaining of information, it's a loss of information from the parent to the offspring, which indicates that there's an original source that had much more DNA and much more information, which plays into last week's episode where we talked about Cain and Abel and how marrying your sibling and everything wouldn't have had as much of a genetic consequence, if you will, because there would have just been so much diversity in the genetic chain that you could, in theory, have reproduced with a sibling at a very early point without that loss of information. So I would definitely agree. And then the other thing that tends to be forgotten as well is that mutations tend to not be very beneficial. Most mutations are pretty bad. There's very few that are actually of large benefit, and of those few that are of large benefit, they don't there's still loss of information as a whole, and it wouldn't necessarily quantify it as a whole different type of animal. You might be able to scientifically classify it as something a little bit different, but you wouldn't necessarily say, oh, we went from, a fish in one generation to a cat in the next generation or something like that.
Hey, stop making fun of my mid-digit hair.
All right. Looks like you got your next logical argument queued up for us there. Hit us with what you got next.
All right, so this is going to be taking our steps. We've logically deduced that the existence of a God is possible, right? And so, for argument's sake, I am going to suppose the Christian God here. Because, well, we're talking about the Bible. So, firstly, we do not mean by divine origin that it was written directly by the hand of God. Though you could, in one of these arguments I will present, say that it was directly by the hand of God. But we'll get there. Right? We mean that the Bible was written by inspiration of God through the Holy Spirit. Now, depending on one's background, that will determine which kind of style of inspiration follows suit. The style of inspiration that I believe is what I would call natural inspiration. All right? And so I'm going to do a brief explanation on what that means, and then we can get into it. So that is that the Spirit inspired either through vision, direction, or circumstances to move a faithful believer to write down the book or letter that would be preserved. That is to say that the God of the Bible is capable of all things, yet chooses not to directly affect free will, but guides a willing and faithful believer to write, and through their faithfulness they write what God desires. This argument to me makes the most sense, as we will discuss when we get to the other ones, and especially as we get into that historical arguments next time, that this just seems to make a little more sense for me.
A good counterpoint I could see to this right off the back, and we're due for another ad break here in a minute, but a good counterpoint I could see to this is that, if there is a God that exists, how do we know he's communicating to us at all? Taking more of that agnostic perspective, where that there's a God out there, but why would he take the time to communicate? Like the I forget, is it the spinning top analogy or something akin to that? Where God kind of kickstarted the universe, and maybe he's just been hands off ever since. So from here, this is where I can kind of start getting into playing devil's advocate a little bit. It's like, okay, well, how do we know it's not something like that, at least in terms of looking at the validity of the Bible? Anything you want to throw in there, Trace? I think we'll take an ad break after your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think I don't have anything to say that you didn't already say. So,
well, with that being said, we'll take a short ad break here and be right back. And we are back, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers and musers. We are here with Harrison Smith talking about the idea of a God and the potential validity or invalidity of Scripture. Why don't you give us your next thoughts on this, good sir? Or Reverend, I guess I should say.
All right. So you just to kind of paraphrase and rephrase what you said, you're saying that if such a God exists, why at all would he be concerned with man? Is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. I mean, we see so many bad things happening in the world, so how do we know? From a Christian perspective, the idea is that, hey, there's a God that loves me and cares about me and has done all of these things for me. So how could we logically disprove, or at least logically say it's unlikely that there is a God out there that just, is hands off, because there's lots of evil in the world. So, I mean, the idea that a good God would intervene and fix everything is definitely not an irrational conclusion, but I feel like you have some different thoughts you want to share.
Yeah. So this is not a new thought by any means. In fact, I'm actually going to talk about someone here who was anointed by the hand of God and still said, "Who am I that you would care?" So in Psalm 8, David writes this, right? He says, "O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set thy glory above the heavens," right? Out of the mouth of babes, you have ordained strength because of our enemies. You are mighty, and you still the enemy and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of our hands, right? Everything that we see around us, the moon, the stars, which you have ordained. What is man that you are mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you would visit him? For you have made him lower than the angels, those heavenly beings that we talk about, right? Those supernatural beings. And you have crowned him with glory and honor. You made him to have dominion over your works. Put all things under our feet. But who is man that you are mindful of us? This is not something new. We've struggled with this question. And so I would argue that you could see that God cares by the fact of what he has done. He's created an earth for you to live on. He's given you the opportunities to be here, to enjoy life. Life in of itself is a gift, whether we realize it or not. So he's given you the chance to enjoy the things, the good fruit, the ability to breathe air, to exercise, to talk and socialize, the ability to have people around you, to enjoy logical discourse. Gave you reasoning, right? These are all gifts of God, whether you want to realize them or not. These are ways and signs that God has given us to understand that he cares. Imagine for just a day if God had not given us the gift of sanity and logical reasoning. What would the world be like?
Definitely be an interesting place, that's for sure. The real world will be a lot more like the internet, because the internet's just all like a whole bunch of ad hominem attacks and everything there. I don't know, Trace, what are your thoughts on all of this?
I mean, yeah, I would agree, but in just the sense of, I mean, and this is a little off topic, but it's just my thought that came up here is whenever the question of the meaning of life comes up, like why are we put here? Why are we living? I think that the answer of just like, well, just to live. And a lot of people ask like, well, if let's say that there's like no afterlife or whatever else. There's just like nothing, no meaning. And then people ask me like, well, why do anything at all then? And I tend to live by just like, well, why not? I mean, if there is nothing, then that means I have no consequences here. But in this sense, there would be consequences. But I think, I mean, we've kind of talked in previous episodes about my opinion, so I won't get too much into those things. But I just think just live on Earth, because even if there is no divine being that gave us all this, then you just still have to do something.
Trace, I have to thank you. That you set up something so beautifully there. Because you're absolutely right. If there is no God, then there is no point to life aside from what we give it, right? If there is no being or mind beyond our own, then it is up to us to determine what is truly moral, what is truly beneficial, what truly has value. So, I mean, you could say, in all honesty, that if there was no God, if there was no creator that gave you inherent value, who said, I have put you on this earth to do this thing, then there is no purpose. And so there is no difference between Hitler and Mother Teresa. And I know that's quite the drastic statement, but that would be the truth if there is no mind beyond ours.
Trace, thoughts? Since that was a response for you more than me.
Yeah, no, I would. I mean, in the sense of what you said at the end there of like what's the difference between Mother Teresa and Hitler. I mean, I still think even without a God, each individual would still have their own thoughts and morals and all that stuff. But then that also brings in the question of like, well, why are there these individual thoughts and morals? I mean, you look at any other animal, they all follow like the same kind of instinct. I mean, there are some individual cases of, one animal might be calmer than the other or more violent than the other, but majority of the time, they all follow the same behavior and instincts, like I said. But with people, it's a completely different story. Everyone has their own instincts or ideas, different behaviors, patterns, all that stuff.
Trace, I love you. I love you so much. You have said so beautifully here. You're talking about what is the difference between man amongst all creation, right? You said it yourself that animals act according to certain patterns and behaviors, right? They're for the most part, very predictable. It's why we have people that are zoologists. They go out there, they can study packs, and they can study different animals as they do. And then that points back to intelligent design in the world, right? These animals are made a certain way, that they do a certain thing, right? And then we're going to go back to what David said. What is man that you are so mindful of him, that you have made him a little lower than angels, but above all created things here on earth, right? He said that you have given us to be over all oxen, all sheep, all the creeping things on this earth. What makes man so different than an animal?
Yeah, I would agree with this conversation. This is nice to be able to sit back on the sidelines a little bit and hear a very, very well thought conversation like this going on. I think this ties into our episode a tiny bit on the Euthyphro dilemma that we did a couple weeks back. I think specifically, what comes to mind is a quote from C.S. Lewis that talks about if good and evil are just a construct or a subjective thing, then there would be no moral pangs, if you will, between choosing to do an evil act versus a good act. It would be the same thing as choosing if you wanted to have an apple or an orange for breakfast, or as we talked about on the Euthyphro dilemma episode, if you wanted to have orange juice or milk, or if you wanted to mix the two and be an absolute heretic. So the fact that there is a general guidance, with exceptions, there's a general guidance between what people would identify as right and what people would identify as wrong, that is indicative that there is an absolute good and that there is an absolute evil to some capacity. But what that capacity is, that's definitely worth exploring and worth talking about. But this deeper lying philosophical concept of an absolute good and of an absolute evil has to exist in some capacity or another, which then infers that there isn't anything per se. I know I said I would try to argue from the other perspective, but I think Trace has given some plenty of the antithesis arguments here to lay it all out. But Trace, what are your thoughts here? What do you have to add on all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I just had another thought while you were kind of chatting here about like individuality kind of thing, right? So in the, I mean, you could still say this with outside of the evolutionary model, but like the from us coming from monkeys and stuff, why don't monkeys have this individuality? I mean, they do to some extent, but not as much as we do. And I mean, there are some animals with higher intelligence that you could look at them and wonder, like, oh, well, that's kind of weird how they do that. Like orcas, for example. There's different families and stuff of orcas. Like the orcas up in Norway, they're gonna hunt fish and just small schools of fish and stuff. But orcas in the North Pole or South Pole, they're gonna hunt seals, and that's what they know how to do. So these animals, they have these individual patterns and stuff. So I guess my question is like, is there an explanation for that in uh this side of the argument here about like, well, God gave us individuality. Now, what about all these animals that still show some individuality, like the different orcapods? I mean, and to further out my point here is that like whales and just cetaceans in general, so like whales, dolphins, all that stuff, they all have kind of their own language in a sense. I mean, they can communicate long distance. Uh, this is just an extended fish fact, I guess. But like orcas, each different pod will have their own language to them, so they can communicate within their pod. So again, it's just like what is what is there to say that God also didn't give them this individuality? I mean, what sets us so apart from them in that sense?
Two fish facts in one episode. You're not getting a creature fact at the end here. Gonna have to cut you off. But I'll kick it back over to our guest here to answer your question and your thoughts.
But first, I have a question about fish.
Okay.
Correct me if I am wrong, because I'm just trying to keep some things straight. Isn't like a dolphin and an orca considered to be of a different class of aquatic mammals?
Yeah, they're part of the cetacean family, which would everything from whales to dolphins would fall under that.
Right. So they are indeed mammals, though, right?
Yeah, yeah, they're
Cool.
mammals.
Cool. Sorry. No, I just had that thought in my head and I couldn't move on beyond that. So, congratulations. 3 fish facts.
There we go. All right, no creature fact at the end of this episode.
I'm gonna ask for a creature fact just for cause. Anyways, so what makes those being creatures different than a human being? And we're gonna turn back to Genesis 1 because that's what we're gonna be overall focusing on here. Just because, hey, you asked me to talk about Genesis 1 through 11. 11. See, I pay attention. Right? And y'all were going over some of this, right? In Genesis 1, 24 through about 26, 27, 28. Yeah. 1 through 24 through 28. As God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, the beasts of the earth, and after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle and the creeping thing, right? And he saw that it was good. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the earth, fowl of the air, and over the cattle and all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So we see a little difference here. I understand, yes, there is individuality, and there's nothing to say that an animal can't have individuality, because they should, right? My dog, may he rest in peace, great dog, loved him, he was absolutely stubborn, right? Loved the dog to death, stubborn. Right? And then there's other people dogs that, they're so passive, they're so docile, right? There's nothing in here that forbids an animal from having personality. The difference is how God created man to have a unique position over all creation, right? We have dominion and responsibility for the creation that God has made, right? And that, again, goes back into how can we know that there is a God that cares about us? Well, he gave you a job and a responsibility. He created you to have purpose on this earth. And that purpose truly does come through working and tending to the things around us. We have a responsibility for those around us.
I mean, I would agree with that from everything we've seen outlined in Genesis 1 and 2, but then that's operating under the assumption that this is a true, untainted account. So I'll kind of use this to segue here and get us a little bit back on track. Is Genesis specifically, and I think you have a little bit broader of a perspective on this, but is what we see in Genesis a valid or an invalid account? And what's the next flow in your argument to fuel this discussion here?
Sorry, I got carried away. I love having intelligent discussions. So my last argument was on what I call natural inspiration, right? That God chooses a faithful and willing person, gives them either vision, direction, or circumstances that moves them to write down the very words that God chooses or would like, right? And this accounts for human free will, right? Why you'll see certain things that, if you're like, man, if God was perfect, why would he allow such an imperfect thing to be here? Well, I believe that he uses man in all of his imperfections. So, you look like you want to say something. No? Okay, cool. I'm going to move into my next argument, which is what I will call the scribe inspiration theory, right? So this one posits a more active role of God, that he will sit there and speak to the writer much like an assistant, and they will write down, generally, the message as given to them. Again, this one is more plausible to me than the last theory that I'll bring up after this. But I also fall more on a free will believer as opposed to someone of free agency, which is another discussion in and of itself. But so imagine this, a boss is sitting there and is telling his assistant to go ahead and write down and make a schedule, and the assistant for the most part, generally outlines the schedule, but also does things that he knows will please his boss when he puts in the schedule together. Hey, I know my boss likes to put a little break in between, meeting with this person and anyone else because, this person gets on his nerves, so he needs some time to decompress. So that is what we call the scribe theory. So they write down most of what God writes and then write things that God generally agrees with in addition to it.
Trace, what are your thoughts on that? No, we'll need to take a quick ad break.
So, do these scribes, do they say that God told them to write it down? I mean, if you say that, sorry, I'm a little blanking on exactly what you said, but you said something about them, like writing down the general idea of it as well. So, like, doesn't that kind of contradict saying that the Bible is absolute fact then, if they're just writing down the gist of it?
So, do we need to pause or okay? So that's where we get into the issue of I understand where people would be like, hey, well that means it's not absolute fact, it's not 100% God's word. Most of the time when I say my last theory, this is what comes up then, but so I'm glad we're getting to it now. If I told you to go ahead and write, the sentence, I love my dog, and you wrote down, I love my red dog, does it still meet what I said?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And now that's a gross oversimplification. I understand. However, they were talking about someone that is faithful and is also, known God for a while. And you'll see oftentimes, especially throughout the Old Testament, later parts that we aren't highlighting, where he'll say, and these were the words of the Lord, as he said unto me. Right? And they will literally write that and write down. You can also see it in the book of Revelation where John says, and thus said Jesus as he appeared to me.
I'm going to put a pause.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Trace.
I just want to say I think that answered my question then.
Sweet.
That's about it.
Awesome. So we'll be right back after this ad break. If you're listening on Spotify or streaming platforms, you know what we're talking about. If you're listening on YouTube, we'll be back in like 2 seconds. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers. Took a short break there to kind of discuss the flow of the show here, if you will. And we've come to the conclusion, unanimous conclusion, that Trace, as the resident skeptic for the show, is definitely doing his job. And he's kind of giving me the day off here a little bit. So with that being said, I will kick it over to you, Reverend Harrison Smith, to continue giving us your thoughts.
I'm not going to lie. During the break, I kind of got lost to where we were. Trace, where were we?
Trace is lost too. He's so lost he's forgot where the mute button is.
Sorry, yeah. Had to do something with the dogs quick. We're good.
Yeah, so
honestly I can't even remember where we were either.
Beautiful. We can just move on. And then if someone was paying attention, they could.
I think we had just wrapped up a point. I do remember that. I don't remember what the point was, but we had just wrapped up a point, I think, so we should be good to move on to the next flow of your logical argument here without any major gaps. And if we go back and listen through on this and it's like, oh hey, we majorly missed following up on some point, we can talk about that for the next episode we have you on for.
Absolutely. All right, so this next theory I'm going to talk about is dictation theory, right? This one is not my house, not my favorite, so don't expect me to be able to defend this one quite as well. This one rests more complete on the complete authority of God, right? God is God, and if he is the God of the Bible, he can do anything, right? So just because God is God, I can't rule against this theory, so I'm going to present it just as factually as again as the other two. So dictation inspiration is that God either possesses the writer or kind of hovers over them and tells them every exact word they need to write down and forcing them to only write down what he desires, right? So kind of imagine this back in the old school days when teachers were sitting there telling you how to write, and if you didn't write it the right way, they kind of smacked your hand and made you redo it, right? So this argument moves away from free will of human beings and moves closer into what we call free agency, where God is able and does take control of our ability to decide for ourselves in order to write down his word here. Yeah,
I mean, these are all just, it sounds like at this point we've kind of dived into just theoreticals about the way that it could have been, assuming the premise of a God, as you kind of laid out in the beginning, assuming the premise of a God, here's the ways that this could have worked logically, and then we're going to build off of this. So I don't know if I have any agreeances or disagreeances with that necessarily, because it sounds like, you're entering, from a scientific perspective, at that point, you're kind of entering the spiritual in a sense, in the ways that God specifically is choosing to move and has acted in the past. And there is no way to, in my mind, to either prove or necessarily disprove that. But Trace, you got any thoughts to interject?
I think if you're saying that there's a free agency kind of thing where God can kind of possess someone to like do whatever he wants, I don't necessarily see, if you're taking it from a biblical perspective, I don't see any evidence to support that. Now, I mean, I also had a question here because you said something about God being all powerful. Now, I've seen this question in a few places, and it just popped in my head here. So if God is all powerful, can he create something more powerful than him? So like, if God is all powerful, can he create an unmovable object that he himself cannot move?
I mean, this is starting to sound a little bit like the Euthyphro dilemma that we were discussing, Trace. About if God is indeed able to do anything, or if he's bound by certain constraints of his will and all of that. But I think Harrison here has some thoughts that he's going to share with you.
So, the question in of itself, can God create something more powerful, or can God create something that he cannot lift, is a logical fallacy, right? It's a common question because people are like, well, the question of all powerfulness comes into like, oh, well, if he's all powerful, he should be able to do anything. Yes, he can do anything, but not everything is logical to be able to happen, right? It's like saying, let me go ahead and, so I'm weak, right? I can only bench about 200 pounds, but let me suddenly magically just think if I add 20 extra pounds on there, I'm still gonna be able to lift it. No, right? The strength isn't there, right? It doesn't logically follow, right? That if I can create something, that I wouldn't be able to lift it. It doesn't logically follow, right? Because God is not bound by physical limitations, so you can't put a physical limitation on him, right? The question of all powerfulness has nothing to do with physical capabilities, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I would agree there, and I think we can move on past that because I don't really have any other follow up there. That was just a little question I had.
Yeah, and so the biblical response to whether or not God can take control of someone and to make them do what he wants literally just comes down to the fact that God can choose to do what he wants, right? We just had the question of, is he all powerful? Well, if he is all powerful, he's able to do all things. And if he's able to do all things, then he can take away our free will and free agency and do with us as he please, right? Now, I personally believe that God chooses to give us free will and that he chooses not to force us to do anything, right? Because that comes into our whole point of salvation, right? That if you are forced to believe, then you're not really choosing God. So it would make no logical sense to say you have to believe and therefore you are saved. No, it's logical to believe that you have a choice to believe. And if you choose not to believe, then it's by your own choice that are you condemned, not by the choice of God.
So wouldn't that make it kind of a conditional love thing? Because isn't the whole premise of God is that he loves everyone unconditionally? Wouldn't that kind of put a condition on it per se?
All right, Trace, let me get your address. I'm going to send you a book, okay? No. I mean, this is part of a logical argument, all right? I'm going to send you a book, all right? If that book arrives in your mailbox, you bring it in, it's still in the package, and it sits on your table. Did I give you a gift?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
I can see where you're going with this.
Yeah. And you, whether or not you choose to read it, is on you. I gave you the gift. It's in your house. You have it. I did everything. I bought it. I packaged it up. I shipped it to you. I brought it all the way to your house. I maybe even take it and put it in your hands. But if you don't open it and read it, who's the one putting a condition on it?
That's fair.
And so that's a very common argument I hear. And a lot of people are like, if God loves us, then why does he put conditions on it? He didn't. You did. Your own actions made you break away from God, right? Just as Eve chose and just as Adam chose in the garden. And I know you haven't gotten to Genesis 3 yet, so I won't spoil it.
No, we have. Yeah, we've got Genesis 3 done, and then we tackled the discussion of free will and everything 2 episodes back. So yeah, we're definitely there. So you're good. There's
cool.
no
right. So at that point, who made Eve sin?
I guess
that's where free will comes into play.
Argument.
Yeah, and that's why we did the Euthyphro dilemma and the free will discussion off of Genesis 3. Immediately following that, because it's a conversation worth having. For that aspect of that free will versus are you being forced to choose? But yeah, anyway, I'm loving this. I'm just able to sit back and let you guys hash all this out. So Trace, I'll kick it over to you because it sounds like you had a good response you had.
No, I was just gonna say that we already kind of had that discussion in whichever episode it was. Now I can't remember.
The Euthyphro dilemma was episode 6. So yeah, and then the Genesis 3 was, I think, episode 5. The listeners might be hearing me and be like, no, it's episode 7 or something like that. I'm trying to keep track here, doing the best I can. But Reverend, we will kick it over to you for your next follow-on point.
All right. We're actually going to get into the meat and potatoes. I know we've been sitting here for an hour and we're just now getting into the meat and potatoes. It's like going and showing up to a good dojo. You got to spend an hour just getting thrown around before you get into the fun part. All right.
And throwing some knees in people's faces too, right? Yeah. That's how I got my black eye from our dear Reverend friend here.
We have a knock at the door.
I guess this is the perfect time for a brief ad break. So we'll be right back after this word from our sponsor. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Mystery Seekers, Musers, we are back. We're going to kick it off to Reverend Smith here for his next point.
And this time without a door knock. All right. So this one is going to sound like really kind of like a duh statement. And I promise you I'm not trying to insult anyone's intelligence. We can believe in the origins of the Bible for the simple fact that it actually exists, right? I know that sounds, you're like, well, you're just kind of assuming something because it exists. Yes, if it didn't exist, we couldn't have the conversation that we're having right now. So I'm going to leave that as the opening statement here because I know that's going to be some point of contention for someone.
It does sound a little bit like circular reasoning there to me, but I'm sure you're going to explain to us what you mean in the depths of your thought there. Trace, anything you want to add there? Or does that seemed like the glaring thing to me, is it does sound like circular reasoning, but I'll leave it to you if you have anything else you want to interject.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the same thing. It sounds like that argument that's like what we had the discussion before of like the Bible can't prove itself. But
and
go on.
I see our Reverend over here shaking his head in excitement, so I think that's exactly what he was hoping we'd say. So I think we've fallen into his trap here.
Hook, line, and sinker. All right. So, well, I don't mean that the Bible proves itself, because, I mean, we'll get into nuances on that some other time. But the Bible and the 66 books that we have exist, right? Each one was written and compiled and put together. This doesn't happen by accident, right? This is something that took over 1,500 years to happen. Written by 40 different authors who didn't meet each other, right? We have some of them who met each other, right? Matthew met Mark, Mark met Luke, Luke met John, right? John met Peter, Peter met Paul, right? All these guys kind of knew each other, but then you also have people who were writing several hundred years apart. I mean, the book of Malachi is like 240 years away from any of the books in the New Testament, right? And then you have people who couldn't have met each other, right? Malachi for sure didn't know who Moses was as a person, but they both wrote about the same things and wrote to the same message of belief and faith and deliverance, right? So the basic facts is this, that over a span of 1,500 years or more, 66 books written by 40 different authors were selected by hundreds of thousands of believers to be put together into one tome and bound up and called the Bible, right? It is no accident. It doesn't happen by chance. And it, in of itself, is evidence that there's something divine moving across millennia of time to make this come together.
Now, could you argue that all of the 40 authors, they may have read the previous works and then wrote off of it?
So you could, right? There's an argument slightly there. But then you have to go into how Genesis and the books of the Torah were written. They were not written based off other written works. There was no basis for that, right? And we'll go into that argument more specifically next time when I'm here, because that's going to involve us breaking out some books and doing some archaeological studies for that. So I'm going to set aside some special time for that. Then you'll also have to consider the fact that, a lot of these books were locked away for a great period of time, especially during the Jewish Exodus under Syria and other many nations that conquered them. So they didn't always have them. And then you had several of them who are alive at the same time in different regions of the kingdoms, right? Because you had the northern kingdom and then the kingdom of Israel, right? So they were separated and conquered at different times. And they were still having these writings done concurrently, right? So you have 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, then you have the books of the major and minor prophets that happened all at the same sort of general time, right? So you'll have passing references where Jeremiah knows about Ezekiel, right? But they didn't know each other. Like they said, hey, that guy is also being faithful. And they just kind of move along, right? So it is fair to say some of the works could have referenced them. We know that the New Testament authors knew very well the books and the prophets of the Old Testament. But, you can't say that logically follows reading Genesis that you're going to be able to write the Gospel of Matthew. And it seems logically coherent without everything else filled in between Genesis and Malachi.
I'd interject as well here, too, that a lot of these accounts are very different in flowing forms of history as well. And that's another thing that we have to bear in mind, is that they go in sequence for the most part, except for things like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles tend to have a bit of overlap, I think, as they're generally, maybe I'm wrong on that. If I'm wrong, you can correct me. But my understanding is 1st, 2nd Kings and 1st, 2nd Chronicles kind of overlap in some of their flow and story and everything. But for the most part, you have a long line of flowing history here where there's not so much repeat. It's more adding to the information in the story. And yes, you have certain things happening at the same time where you have certain books of like the prophets and everything being written, and they're having events happen to them and everything while certain things are going on. Like, for example, we're going to talk about Daniel in the future when we're studying angels and demons and everything like that. So you have the book of Daniel that's being written during the Babylonian captivity, and then that flows into another type of captivity, and another, I think, is like Persia, and then all these other nations take over. And there's historical consistency and validity for this as far as I've studied and everything. But Trace, what do you have to interject here?
I mean, if we weren't so short on time, I think I could have a lot of other points. But you mentioned bringing up on next time you're on, so I'm gonna mark down some of my questions here and save that for another episode, because I don't want to get too into that. I feel like that my questions are gonna have a whole other episode worth of conversation behind it.
Well, I'll leave it up to you two fine gentlemen here to decide if you want to hash into Trace's conversation or if you want to continue with the general outline of flow that you have, Harrison. That'll be for you to decide. We got about another 10 minutes or so before we'll need to call it here. I'm fine either way.
Okay, so I'm going to preface this just because I absolutely want to hear Trace's question, just because I'm a curious guy. But I also understand the wisdom and saving it for later. Because right now, all we are trying to do here is just have logical arguments in place, right? To understand where these things come from, and just kind of a general understanding of the reasoning that could be followed. A lot of the evidences and a lot of that sort of stuff, I will get into the weeds next time I'm here. Right? We're generally doing more of a general outline here. So Trace, with that in mind, if it falls into a more general logical discourse, then awesome, bring it up and we'll keep going.
Okay, so you mentioned, you could make the argument that other books were written off previous works, but you can't say the same for Genesis. Now, Genesis, at least from my very base understanding here, is somewhat of a creation story and a little bit of a beginning and origin story there. And would I be correct in saying that?
I mean, you're not wrong at all. Uh, that's totally the wrong way to say that. You're right. But there's more to it, right? So Genesis, the word in of itself means beginning, right? I'm pretty sure y'all went over that already.
I didn't hit on that specifically. No, I focus more on the content and the actual title of the book. That's probably my bad.
Okay. Well, it means beginning, right? That's all it's saying. This is the beginning, right? It talks about obviously the beginning of history, and then it goes into your beginning of the patriarchy, right? And this is referring to the patriarchy of the Jewish faith of Abraham and moving into Joseph and 12 tribes.
Okay, so it's basically like the beginning and then like setting up kind of rules, more or less.
Genesis doesn't get too much into the rules. Genesis is literally more about telling you the grand origin of everything, right? You'll see the drastic difference between Genesis, Numbers, and Leviticus, right? Those will get a lot more into the rules of how you're supposed to act, and you're literally here, of, hey, this you shall not do and this you should do, right? You'll hear a lot more of that in those. So Genesis is a lot more story, a lot more history, whereas going into, how and why things are.
Okay, so I know you said that it's more than that, but let's just, for the sake of the argument, Genesis is the beginning, as its meaning is. So what if, let's say, you take the Norse creation myth and all of those stories, and now that's more or less one work there. So if future books, let's say Norse mythology, follow the same history as the Bible, like it has the one book and then all of these other people wrote about something that kind of correlated back to that. Now, could you make that argument of like, well, you still have the one origin work, but what's not to say still that these other works they didn't read off? Because you said that some of the people still, some of the people like were familiar with the work. So would that still would that make a bias, or would it still just kind of be its own like standalone thing? Like you can distinctly say that New Testament books that mention the Old Testament, that they are still their own work, or would they be based off of the Old Testament still?
Okay, Trace, I'm going to ask you to kind of just resum that question, because I was trying to follow it, but you had a lot of kind of interjections into adding qualifiers in there. So could you just resum that question for me?
Yeah. Okay. Uh, Genesis was the original work. Could you argue that some other mythology could follow the same pattern of the Bible and be quote unquote solidified in modern day?
Mm. Okay. So let me stop backing away from the mic. With that question, you could, right? There's no way you couldn't, all right? But herein lies the difference, right? You're talking about multiple people writing prophecies at the same time about a guy that would show up over 300 years later. And this guy had to be born, and had to be literally be born the right way, right? If he wasn't born in the right place with the right set of circumstances, how else could he have fulfilled those? You can't tell me that a baby chose where they are born, who they are born unto, and much less to be born without a father, right? So that's where we get into the differences, right, between other sort of mythologies and what we get into here with what the Bible is presenting. I understand that there's commonalities when people like to bring up creation stories, because everything has to come back from somewhere, right? So, yeah, you could go back to a lot of creation stories and then base a history and timeline around them, but ultimately they have to be able to be rooted back into some sort of evidence and proof, right? And that's going to be kind of where we go into my next point, right?
Sadly, I think we'll have to cut you off there, because we're coming up on just over an hour here, hour 15-ish, and Trace has somewhere to be tonight. But these are great questions to ask. I'm loving these questions. I think this is the beginning of a great conversation to have here. But this is the crux of Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix, is we're exploring all these different myths and stories and perspectives, and we're trying to dig to the root of what really happened. And there's a reason we're starting with the Bible, aside from just my Christian faith and beliefs and Trace's faith and beliefs. But we'll get into that and explore that, and it'll become more and more evident to you as the listeners as we continue this conversation here. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap up here. So this has been Harrison Smith, Reverend Harrison Smith. You can find him on YouTube. Him and his father have a ministry that they work on together. It's called the Way of Christ Ministries. So I'm going to put a plug in there if you really like his thoughts, and you want to hear some more faith and theology-based stuff specifically, you can find him there. They also have a website, theway-of-christ.org, where you can explore some more of their ministry there. And he's also told me that at some point they're speculating him and his dad possibly will do a book at some point on this topic that we're discussing. So go ahead.
To be more accurate, it'd be a chapter in a book.
Okay, fair enough. So a chapter in a book, but hey, that's still something. So with that being said, we are gonna close out here. That's where you can find all the information from our guests there. I didn't miss anything there, did I? Hit everything that you wanted me to. Awesome. So this is not the end of the conversation. We will be back to talk about this in at least probably 2 more episodes. I'd say this might even bleed into doing 4 episodes total, depending on how it goes and all the questions that our resident skeptic has for our guest. So stay tuned for that. It'll be a couple episodes before we have Reverend Smith back on with us, and he won't be in person. He'll be through virtual call, and I'll actually be in person with Trace at that point. But yeah, so again, if you want to get a hold of us, you can email us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at m.quad.musings. You can find us on Facebook at Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. And I think I will wrap it up there. Trace, you have anything final you want to interject as we're closing out here?
I just wanted to throw in, because I still gotta honor the monster fact. It's a very short one. I'll just throw it in here. The myth of Loch Ness doesn't originate from that iconic picture. It actually goes back to the 16th century from a story of Saint Columba fighting off a water beast off of the shores of Loch Ness. That is all I have to say.
All right, there you go. You kept it short. I like it, but that does almost sound like a 4th fish fact for this episode. So all of our other fish nerds out there, they're definitely loving this episode, I'm sure. Well, we're going to close it up here, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers. Thanks for tuning in, and look forward to having you join us for the next episode.